Hi guys, welcome to complete Flutter chat tutorial series. This is the third part where we will add the feature of sending messages to one registered user to another. If you're new here, then do check out the part 1 and 2 where we have created authentication logic and user registration. Before going through the code, let's check out the application in our physical device. Once the application is launched and there exists a login and register user, you will be taken directly to the home page. In contact tab, we can see that there is only one contact. Note, I have only registered 2 users, hence there is only one user available for chat. We can see the trailing arrow button to the right. Upon tap, it will take the user to the conversation UI. Before doing that, let's check out the second tab in our home page, that is the chat. There displays the same list style with username, email and trailing button. It might seem as same as the contact page, but it is not. If there are 100 users registered to our application and you have only initiated chat with 10, then the chat tab will display those 10 users, whereas the contact page will display all 100 users. Not to mention, on clicking the profile button, it will display the name of the login user. I have done that because I was getting confused between which user I have logged in with. So the second tab of home, we have the chat page that will display the list of conversation that you have on FireStore. So it is a list view that displays the list of users that particular conversation is for. It has a display image of the receiver, name, email and right arrow key to take you to the conversation. Let's check out the code now. As we go on to the chat folder on the VS Code, we can see that chat page on the view folder. The chat page is a stateless widget. On its build, we are going into a private class called chat view that is part of a chat block that has a dependency to chat repository, which has a dependency to chat Firebase provider, and that has a dependency to the FireStore instance. On the chat block, I have triggered an event that is the chat requested with the login user UID. On the chat view class, depending on the state of the chat block, we are building the UI accordingly. So like always, on loading state, that is the chat load in progress, we have circular progress indicator. For failure, we have the failure message, and finally on the successful call on Firebase, we have the chat list while providing the authenticated user. The chat list, as the name suggests, it is responsible for displaying the list of chat you have. If there is no conversation, then a text is displayed from a localization text which says you do not have any active chat as of now. If you want to create a new chat, then go to the contact page to chat with somebody somewhere over this line. Okay, as list builder is created containing the existing chats. In the item builder, I have fetched the chat from state.chats using the index and identified the receiver. Then return the chat body with appropriate receiver and sender. So the chat body is a list style containing a detail of the receiver. On its leading, we have circle avatar with the profile image URL, title with its display name, and subtitle with email ID. On its trailing, we have icon button that will navigate to the conversation page while sending the receiver and sender details appropriately. On the back end part, seeing how exactly the chat view works, let's see from the data layer, that is the data folder on the chat folder. In the provider folder, we have one more class called chat_firebase_provider, which communicates with the FireStore database. It has a method called getChats that takes in the login user UID. Based on that, it queries the collection in FireStore with the collection name conversation, with a where clause for members array which contains the login UID. Basically, it is asking for all the documents in the conversation collection that has the login UID in its member array, which is then mapped to a list of map of string and dynamics, in turn making the return type of this method to be future of list of map of string and dynamic. So the conversation repository is a wrapper for our conversation Firebase provider. It will call the getChat method and converts the future list of map of string and dynamics to our data model called getConversation. So our UI layer doesn't have to know about the map. So the return type of the getChat method is the conversation repository is future of list of conversation. Now on the chat block, we have dependency for chat repository. Here we have only single event to take care of, that is the chat requested, that gives the job to the private method called on chat requested to state. You don't have to forward the job to job or make a different method. You can write the entire code here, but for the sake of readability, we have moved the code to another method. This method takes in the account for the chat event, that is the chat requested, and has the emitter of for the chat state. Within the try catch, we have first it will emit the chat load in progress because we are going for a task that might take some time. Then we try to get list of chats from chat repository by fetching the login UID from the event. If successful, we will return the success state, that is chat load success, with the list of chats, or I should say conversations. Else we will return the failure state from the catch block, that is the chat load failure, with the appropriate message from our localization file. In case there are no chats, then it will still send a chat load success with the empty list of conversation. In other two file in the block, there's chat event that has a class called chat requested that has login UID and extends chat event. It should be triggered to fetch the chats from the block. Second file is the chat state. It has 4 classes, all extending the chat state. First, the chat initial, we don't use it that much. Chat load in progress for loading, and chat load failure that takes a string for failure message, and finally chat load success that takes a list of chat, that is the list of conversation model. Now we looked into the contact page of the home that displays a list of contacts. It has a newly created trailing button that takes the user to the conversation page that is similar to the arrow key found on the chat page. Both leads to the conversation page of the login UID and the receiver image that is being displayed. Currently chat can only be created from the contact page. We can simply add plus button or something on the chat page to create a new conversation. Once clicking the arrow button in the contact, new conversation is created, even though there is not a single message that is being shared between the two. So now it's time to look into the conversation view for sending and reading the messages. Let's explain the UI of the conversation first. Then I will explain the logic I use in creating the conversation and storing them. And finally, I will show the code. Conversation UI has an app bar. From left, it has a back button that takes back to the page it was called from. On its title, the name of the receiver, and on the right, as the image of the message receiver. Body contains 2 parts, one for showing the messages that are shared among the two, and other part for sending messages. Whilst showing the messages, all the messages received are aligned on the left, and all the messages that are sent by the login users are aligned towards the right with a different color. For sending messages, it has a text field and a arrow button. On clicking the text field, keyboard will appear and you will be able to write messages that you want to send. On clicking the arrow button on the right, it will display a circular progress indicator, and on sending it, it will remove the text from the text field and display back the send button. Once the message is sent or received, the list view or the message body will update on real-time basis as it is constantly listening to FireStore for any changes. So the logic that I implemented for conversation and storing them on FireStore is I have first created a body or a model that is called conversation. The conversation has a unique ID and sender receiver detail. For every new conversation between the two unique users, a conversation is created under the conversation collection in FireStore. That will help me query FireStore and display all the active conversation for login user. Then there's another model called message that represents each message that is shared between two users in any conversation. In order to identify who has sent this message to whom, it has a detail of the receiver and sender. It also has a conversation ID to identify which conversation this particular message belongs to. It has a timestamp so that we can use it for displaying the messages in a conversation in some kind of a timely order. Now for the important part, the code or the implementation. Let's go to the conversation folder and to the views. Open the conversation underscore page dot. Here it might have the conversation ID because this page could be accessed by the contact page as well as chat page. In the chat page, we have already looked for existing conversation, if any, for the login user. If user goes from the chat page to the conversation page, it will have the conversation ID. Else, if user goes from the contact page, it will not have the conversation ID. On its build method, it will call the chat detail requested event on conversation block whilst giving the sender and receiver detail and sets the child as conversation view. It will create a app bar with the receiver name and image. Based on the state of the conversation block, it will display the content on its body. If the conversation is loaded successfully, the conversation main view is called with login user and receiver with the conversation ID, if any. Whilst conversation detail is requested, if there exists no conversation, the new conversation is created for that particular users, for which conversation block will return conversation creation success. Conversation main view is again called for this state with users and newly created conversation ID. On loading, circular progress indicator, and finally for failure, a conversation load failure text from localization file that is displayed. On conversation main view, we have a list view with two children, one for displaying all the messages and one for sending the messages. First, the size box. Here we are trying to identify the size available for displaying the messages after removing the space taken by app bar and the container that contains the text field. So on its body, we add a new event on the message receiver block called the message requested with conversation ID. Child would be the conversation message view, and on the second child of the conversation main view contains a container that provides a message sender block to the conversation sender view with login user, receiver, and conversation ID. In conversation underscore message underscore view dot, we have a block builder on its build method, which checks up the state of message receiver block and updates the UI accordingly. Like always, for loading we have circular progress indicator. For failure we have text saying unable to fetch message from localization file, and finally on its success we send the message received for the conversation ID to message list builder private class. On message list builder, we have a list of messages and login user UID. If the message is empty, then it displays a text saying no message found, else we'll create a list view builder. We have set the properties of list view builder as reverse and length to the count of messages received from state. For its item builder, we have retrieved the message using the index and sent to another private class called message body. Message body has a property of bool, which is called the isMine, to identify whether the message belongs to the login user or not. On its build method, there is align widget. Based on isMine value, it is aligned towards right or left. Child of a align is a container with some margin and padding, and most important property is the width, which I have set to take max width to 70% using the box constraint. The color of container also changes with isMine property, and of course the child of the container is a text, which is the content of the message with the color set to white. In conversation underscore view underscore in conversation underscore sender underscore view dot, we have the conversation ID, sender and receiver, and it is a stateful widget. On its conversation sender view state, we have a text editing controller and a string to hold the message. Init method sets the message text controller to text editing controller, and dispose method disposes the text editing controller. Build method has a row. First child is a text field, and the controller is message text controller. I gave some decoration to the text field. And second child is the block consumer. We have used block consumer because on success I want to empty the text field for the next message. Hence we use this set to clear the text field using the controller. Builder will display a circular progress indicator during a message being sent to FireStore. And finally, icon button upon click will trigger the new event called message sent to the message block with the message model created using the properties. That's the explanation for the view of conversation, message sender and receiver. Let's go to the backend logic of each of them one by one. First, the conversation folder or the conversation. Let's go to the data folder. We have conversation underscore firebase underscore provider dot in provider folder. The first method in the class is get conversation ID. It returns a feature of map of string and dynamics. Upon querying the FireStore on collect conversation, it returns a feature of map of string and dynamics. Upon querying the FireStore on conversation collection, we have here created an array first, which contains the UIDs of the both login UID and the receiver UID. In our FireStore query, we have used where in and used our created array as it is and also in reverse form. So the match document fetch is the one that has both users UID in it. If document is found, then the first data is sent, else null is returned. Second method, that is the create conversation, which takes conversation model without the conversation ID. Since we have not created the conversation, so we have not got the conversation ID. Later, it creates a new document in conversation collection, then updates the received document ID as a conversation ID on the document once again, and then returns the conversation ID as return type. The conversation repository has the similar method as the conversation Firebase provider. The difference is that it will change the received return type from the conversation Firebase provider into the models that are understood by our Bloc, or I should say to the models that we have created for easier implementation and coding. So in get conversation, it changes the received map of string and dynamics to null or conversation model. In create conversation, since the return type is only string, we haven't changed anything. Business logic or the block of our conversation is as follows. Conversation block handles two events. One is conversation detail requested and other is the conversation created. As we have discussed earlier, whenever conversation page is open, it will look for conversation detail. If found, it will receive the conversation model, else a new conversation document is created and that new conversation model is sent back to the conversation page. When conversation detail requested event is received on conversation block, it will first send back the loading state, then conversation detail is requested using conversation repository dot get conversation method. If detail is found, conversation load success state is returned with conversation detail. If conversation detail is not found from calling that method, new event is triggered on the same block called conversation created with the required detail except the conversation ID. If there is any exception during this process, conversation load failure state is thrown back. Let's look into the conversation created method. First, loading state is thrown since we are going into the FireStore to update a new record. After that, conversation ID is fetched using the create conversation method of conversation repository class. On success, conversation ID is sent back. If there is any exception during this process, a conversation load failure state is thrown. Second, on the message folder, let's check the message receiver block first. Message receiver is responsible for constantly looking for new messages for a particular conversation ID and return the messages from FireStore to the UI. In data layer, message Firebase provider look into the get messages. The return type of this method is stream, then a list of map of string and dynamics, or that could be null. That's the key here, how we query the FireStore. As we can see, we check for message collection. Then in our where condition is that give all the messages that has the same conversation ID or one I am sending it. Then order it by the timestamp on each record, and we need the snapshot, not the document ref. After receiving the stream of snapshots, we have mapped or convert the data to list. Here, running the query for first time, it might ask you to use index since we are doing some ordering. There you can simply check the log and follow the link for its implementation. Now the message repository calls the same method and converts the stream of list of map of string and dynamics to a stream of list of message model. So on the message receiver block, it handles two events. First being the message requested, it emits the loading state, then subscribe to the stream of message repository.get messages. So the whenever data, that is the list of message, is received, it will trigger a new event, the message received, with its data as list of message. There will be a message load failure if there is any exception during this process. The event, that is message received, is fairly simple to handle. The event has newly updated data, that is the list of messages. So the block will directly emit a new state called message load success with the same data. Thing to remember here is we have a property of this class called stream subscription that is cancel on close method of this block. Finally, let's go to the message sender block. Here we have only one event to handle, that is the message send. So in the data layer, we can see in the class message Firebase provider on its method called add message, there requires a map and return type is future of void. It is a simple method, goes to the messages collection and adds a document, that is the map you have just created. So in the message repository, we call the same method. Here we can see that map is received from calling the toMap of the message model. I recommend checking the message model once again. On message send event, loading state, that is the message send in progress, then await for the send message method to complete from the message repository and return the message send success. Throw message send failure state in case of any exception. Thus we have completed the sending and receiving logic of our chat application. I know there could be many things to be added, removed or improved. This is the simplest way I could come without putting much of the effort. This video took long time to produce, but the code was ready for very long time. I recommend following the code in GitHub for faster updates. Thank you so much for watching. Follow me on social and don't forget to give star to this repo in the GitHub if you learn something from it. Okay guys, see you next time.